Hello and welcome to Alita Dogma Shades of Murder, a podcast where I will share and discuss tales of true crime, mysteries, and all things dark and macabre. If you eat, play, and dream in shades of murder like me, well then welcome my kindred spirits to your new podcast home. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow, subscribe, share, and rate so I can present more stories to you. And we can all embrace the love, the darkness together. All of my contact information you can find in the episode description below. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case and may not be intended for all audiences. The Roman Emperor Nero, Lizzie Borden, the Menendez brothers, and Jennifer Pan were all perpetrators of homicide when they were young adults. Some lived decades, others centuries apart from one another, and all came from very different backgrounds. But they all shared a common connection. They were all offenders in some of the most infamous cases where children, or in these cases young adults, have murdered their parents. Parricide, the murder of one's own parents or step-parents, is an extremely rare homicidal event that accounts for between 2 to 3% of all annual homicides in the United States. The FBI estimates that somewhere between 200 to 300 incidents of parricide occur every year. In comparison, on an international scale, it is exceptionally rare, with the United Kingdom as an example, only having an average of 9 cases a year. Patricide is defined as the killing of one's own father, and matricide is the term for killing one's own mother. Most offenders are of legal age at the time of the act, with 1 in 5 being under 18 years old and 30% being under the age of 20. It has been found that adolescent offenders are usually driven to commit the crime due to circumstances of their lives being out of their control. They are most likely to be totally dependent upon their parents and have no viable options to leave. As a result, for one reason or another, they resort to murdering their parents instead of remaining in their current living situation. However, research has shown that adult perpetrators of parricide are overwhelmingly motivated by financial gain or suffer from psychopathy. Analysis of patricide incidents that were committed between 1976 and 2007 revealed that fathers and stepfathers were primarily killed by their children who were older than 18, and most offenders were male. This is the case of Andreu Coll Tur and his father, the wealthy Spanish businessman, Andreu Coll Tur. Set off the coast 150 miles from Barcelona, Spain, is the mesmerizing and largest of the Balearic Islands, the island of Mallorca, which as of 2021 had around 920,000 residents. As diversified in the landscape as it is in its beauty, the island has 2 large mountains that surround its magnificent turquoise waters. On the island, one can find olive groves, pine forests, terraced slopes, limestone caves, and rich valleys where a bounty of fruits and vegetables grow, in addition to being host to more than 70 wineries. Mallorca is rich in its history, with its lands once used as battlegrounds for pirates and conquests. A notorious 16th century feud between 2 noble families, the Canamuns and the Carnavals, whose sworn hatred for one another resulted in a confrontation for 60 years, is reenacted by the entire community of Mallorca in an annual water fight. Mallorca is very unique in its meshing of culture, architecture, and cuisine, with influences from Spain, Italy, and North Africa due to its distinct location. From the exquisite towering Gothic cathedral of Santa Maria of Palma to leisurely strolling the streets of Palma, where there are remnants of Roman, Moorish, Arabic, Muslim, Jewish, Byzantine, and Christian influences, the island of Mallorca is considered to be a dreamy cultural destination. I will be honest that I was not very familiar with Mallorca until my favorite techno DJ, Naomi Black, who is an incredibly talented, genuine, and beautiful artist, decided to call the island her new home. One of the reasons I wanted to tell this story is so that I could learn more about the place she lives and to pay tribute in some small way to her and her music. On June 30th, 2013, 18-year-old Andreu Coll Tur was overwhelmed with excitement, antsy, and amped up about what laid within the safe. His close friend and fellow gamer, 20-year-old Francisco Abbas Rodriguez, expressed regret that he could not be there with him to witness its unveiling in person. He was hopeful about both of their futures, which he openly wished would be shared together. Francisco told Andrew on the phone that his actions were done out of love, and Andrew conveyed to him that, even if only as friends, they would live together and have a lot of wealth and luxury to enjoy amongst one another. 2 years prior, the two young men had bonded and become fast friends online playing Call of Duty, which, for those of you who are not familiar, is a first-person shooter war-themed game and is one of the most popular and best-selling video game franchises of all time. Andrew called himself Tactical Men, which he referred to as the hidden killing machine. The two boys connected over their mutual obsession with the game and sometimes played upwards of 14 hours a day. The two formed a team online and chatted all the time via their PlayStation consoles and also through Skype. Andrew traveled to the mainland to visit his new friend Francisco in person, and Abbas did the same, coming over to Mallorca to spend time with him. Neither of the young men had friends outside of each other. Whereas Andrew saw in Francisco a brotherly love and bond, Francisco was in love with Andrew and openly expressed his affection for him. Andrew did not reciprocate his feelings because he was only interested sexually in girls, but it did not seem to do any harm to the guy's friendship. Andrew was one of 3 siblings who came from separated parents, but he was the only one of them who had remained living with his father, Andreu Coll Tur, in Alara, Mallorca. Mr. Benassar Coll incessantly encouraged his son to complete his education, even though the same expectations were not placed upon his 2 brothers. Young Andrew had long dreamed of being in law enforcement, but instead had become a personal assistant at his own father's lucrative business. For the past 3 years, he had been living with his father on the beautiful island of Mallorca, Spain, because he wished to enjoy a more luxurious life than what his mother could provide him. His father, Benassar Coll, was one of the wealthiest men in Mallorca. Through his real estate agency, a slot machine company, and 100 properties he owned in various regions of Spain, Andrew Sr. was valued at around 50 million euros. For those of you who aren't aware of the value of the euro, 1 euro currently equates to $1.12 US. This means that his father was worth over $56 million in US currency. The recent hostility and tension which had arisen between his ex-wife and his 2 other sons led Coll Benassar to abruptly cut them out of their inheritance. This left 18-year-old Andrew as the sole beneficiary of a massive estate of wealth. In the summer of 2013, Andrew invited the smitten Francisco to spend the summer with him at his father's mansion, where they shared his bedroom and even slept in the same bed. This invitation lured Francisco in with the promise that after murdering his father, he and Andrew would live together and share his multi-million euro estate. On June 28, 2013, 2 days after Francisco Abbas arrived at Andreu Coll's home, or rather his father's, the young men attempted to kill him, but failed. That night, they made a cake and placed several sleeping pills in the batter, hoping that Senor Coll would be incapacitated enough for them to make their move. Within 30 minutes, he was passed out cold, and together they snuck into his bedroom. Francisco swung at him with a wooden bat, hitting him while Andrew blinded him with a flashlight. Suddenly, his father became conscious enough, and the young man freaked out, running away before he could understand what was happening. Senor Coll only had vague memories of a man hitting him with something, and concerned that the boys might also be in danger, he screamed out to them. Andrew and Francisco did their best to calm him down and attempted to manipulate his father into believing that maybe it was only a dream. However, Senor Coll was not as dense and as easily manipulated as his son and fellow friend believed him to be. The following day, he told his sister Marguerite that he had suspicions about Andrew. He shared how he had been all over both boys that week, forcing them to work, which he knew they were not happy about, and that they had a wooden stick near the bed, which he had seen them messing around with earlier. The following day, around 1 a.m., Andrew and Francisco would strike again. When his father returned home, Andrew called him up to his bedroom to check out his phone. Upon his arrival, Francisco ambushed him from behind and struck Senor Coll with the first of 40 blows to his head and body that would complete their mission. The wooden bat that the boys used was adorned with 4 nails measuring 4 inches each at one end. It was an exact replica of a weapon used by Andrew in the zombie-killing video game Dead Rising 2, which he had proudly crafted. Andrew watched, along with his delusional friend, as Andreu Coll Tur took his last breath and died. They first bathed his body with the garden hose and placed him into a fresh set of clothes. In an attempt to create the ruse that he had been robbed, they stole one of his Rolex watches, a gold ring, and a briefcase that held 12,000 euros in cash. They then dragged his body over to his Land Rover, drove the vehicle, and dumped it off the outskirts of Valaro, about 15 kilometers away from the scene of the crime. Within only a few hours, 2 of their neighbors discovered his vehicle with his body laying inside. An acquaintance saw the boys returning to the chalet around 4 in the morning in the Audi TT that Coll's father had so generously gifted his son. Only 3 days would pass when the civil guard listened to a conversation between Andrew and Francisco about how they would split up the fortune. Andrew shared his plan to kick his Aunt Marguerite out of his father's company and divide his inheritance between the 3 brothers. Francisco immediately expressed his concern about sharing the wealth with Andrew's 2 other brothers, but Andrew reassured him that there was more than enough. Still, it was obvious that Francisco was losing his cool already and told Andrew how he suspected that his aunt knew something about what they had done. To this, Andrew got upset with Francisco and warned him to not speak any more of this over the phone. It was later revealed that the Serious Crime Squad had placed both men under surveillance for a few days. After Andrew buried his father that Wednesday, he and Francisco were taken into custody. They were not so tough once they were faced with interrogation by the Guardia Civil, which are the Mallorcan police. In very little time, once they were arrested on charges of murder, both young men immediately broke their promise of silence to one another and confessed to the crime they had committed. Andrew the next day returned to the scene of the crime with law enforcement investigators to reconstruct exactly how his father's murder unfolded. According to Andrew, he had been exhausted by his father's constant humiliation and berating of him, and he had had enough. Andrew attempted to justify murdering his own father and claimed alleged psychological abuse by him, especially while working at his company. He complained about how his father would criticize him in front of others and humiliate him, telling him he was useless, a social waste, and how he was forced to work longer hours at the company than others did because he was his son. However, these allegations were not backed up by his partner in murder, Francisco, who said that the son and father bickered and argued about a lot of things, but that Andrew was not abused or humiliated. Rather, he expressed to the police that Andrew was not left with many options, since if he had left his father's house, he would be left with nothing. So the only real answer was to kill him. Regarding the sequence of events, according to the authorities, Andrew said how he had been pushed too far. In the early hours of Sunday morning, he snapped when his father returned back to the chalet, and they attacked him. Both young men admitted to beating Andrew's father all throughout the house with a hammer, a vase, and Andrew's prized weapon, his Dead Rising 2 bat with nails jutting out from the end. Andrew did claim that he crafted the weapon 2 months prior as a creative expression and did not intentionally make it to be used as a weapon in his father's homicide. The 57-year-old father attempted to flee from the house, but they beat him with random objects as he tried to run down the stairs and escape. He eventually collapsed in the lounge room of his home, bleeding profusely, his bones shattered, and died. This story was corroborated by the fact that there were traces of blood on the walls, on the telephone, and in the basement. They told the police that they abandoned his remains in his Land Rover, which they parked near the gate of Bunyola Cemetery. On Friday, it was revealed during the bail hearing that it was not a crime of passion or an impulsive act of homicide, as the victim's son had attempted to make the police believe, but rather it was fully premeditated. When Andrew was arrested, he had 15,000 euros on his person, and when the safe was opened inside his father's house, it was discovered that 200,000 euros had been stolen. The court also learned about how the victim had been drugged and had an attempt on his life made by both young men only one day before. Close to midnight that same night, the judge declared that both Andrew and Francisco remain in prison to await their trial. What would be deemed an embarrassment to our criminal justice system and a slap in the face of justice, although there have been plenty of cases which our system should hang its head low for, Andreu Coll was only given 17 and a half years for brutally murdering his own father. His accomplice Francisco Abbas received 16 and a half years in prison for his participation in the crime. To attempt to understand this sentence for premeditated first-degree murder, it is important to be aware of the extreme differences that exist between the criminal justice system in the United States versus the system in Spain. It is also important to note that Spain is considered one of the safest countries in Europe and has a relatively low crime rate, especially in the realm of violent crimes, in particular murder. For cases of homicide, the United States has more than 10 times the rate of murder than Spain per 100,000 residents. Yet our criminal justice system is deemed to be one of the harshest systems in the world. It is difficult to not question whether our current crime control model of justice is effective at preventing or controlling crime when we have some of the highest rates of incarceration in the world. The criminal justice system in Spain is unique to ours in the United States in several ways. First, in the United States, any criminal charges made against an individual are brought about solely by a prosecutor who represents the government. Depending upon the jurisdiction of the crime, this could be state, district, county, commonwealth, or federal prosecutor who decides whether or not to pursue official charges against the defendant. The criminal law in Spain allows anyone who has been witness to a criminal act to provide the police or judicial authorities with information regarding the crime. In fact, anyone who is known to have been a witness to a crime and does not report it can be faced with a penal fine. This is in stark contrast to our laws, which do not hold it against someone who witnesses a crime if they do not inform law enforcement, except under certain circumstances. Also known as the bystander effect, this is a term used to describe circumstances where others see or hear about crimes but do nothing to intervene in the situation. Based on data gathered by the U.S. Department of Justice, bystanders are present during assaults as much as 70% of the time and about half of the time during the commission of a robbery. This is not at all surprising to me because when I was a victim of such a crime, there were several people literally standing on their porches, looking out their windows, and watching it happen while I screamed for help, and no one did a damn thing to stop it. I digress, but I can empathize with this statistic and the victims and how it represents our absence of societal involvement. It is important to note how Spain punishes people, even if it is only by a minimal fine, for their behavior that does not assist in a crime from being stopped or reported. This establishes a culture by which individuals are morally and legally responsible for speaking out and reporting crimes they are witnesses to. The Spanish National Court is composed of 6 chambers, all of which have an individual judge who presides over them. When a criminal case is submitted to the court, the judge, if the case or complaint is accepted, will then initiate and oversee the investigation, which can range from a month long up to several years. Once the investigation has come to its conclusion, the judge closes the initial case and effectively hands it over to a tribunal court, which typically includes a panel made up of 3 judges. it is their duty to preside over what is referred to as the quote-unquote oral phase of the case, aka the trial. There are some Spanish courts that involve the use of a jury of citizens during the trial phase, but that is limited, and the vast majority of trials are conducted either by a single judge within the lower courts or a panel of judges as aforementioned in the higher courts. Within the prison system, the rights and liberties of those incarcerated are much more progressive and liberal than our own. Under their constitutional right to respect and dignity, these freedoms for inmates in Spain include the right to be addressed by their own names, speak in their own language, and wear their own clothing. Searches, including full-body strip searches, are only conducted in the most extreme of circumstances and are not considered a normal process of being in prison. Perhaps degradation, identity erasing, and personal violation of our inmates are not the answer. In regards to the sentencing in Spain, their punishments and their prison system are based on a model of rehabilitation. Spain's constitution states that any measures of detainment and security must be enforced with the purpose of re-education and social reintegration of the individual. Every person inside prison is given a paid job, social security benefits, accessibility to their own culture, and nourishment of their individual personality. Within the prison, inmates have their rights still intact, including civil, social, economic, and political, including the right to vote, with the only exceptions made to this rule if the circumstances of their arrest or enforcement of their sentence are deemed incompatible with these rights. Work that is dignified and suitable for the individual to achieve outside of their detainment is prioritized, in addition to the importance of education. Spain's prison system is fundamentally the opposite of our own, which is based on penalization and ostracization of the convicted from our society while they are incarcerated and once they are freed. Spain's primary purpose in the individual's incarceration is to help the person progress and develop their character and ethical compass to the point that they are a law-abiding citizen when they return to their communities. Through various programs including education, socio-cultural, recreational, and sports activities, their prison system aims to help provide therapy and assist in the all-around development of the person so they change their ways and can return to their communities as productive and positive citizens. It is rooted in the concept of rehabilitation via intervention, and their country has gauged that this is the best approach with the goal of preventing recidivism, also known as reoffending. While we have minimum, medium, and maximum security prisons, Spain has 3 degrees of imprisonment, where even the most violent and serious of criminals can have the opportunity to earn the 3rd or less severe conditions of imprisonment. This classification is given initial sentencing based on the severity of the crime's nature and is open to being reclassified every few months. A change in degree is determined by the analysis of the individual's evolution, as shown through their conduct, attitude, and participation in programs and activities. Change in degree for the worse can also occur if a prisoner behaves in ways that are indicative of their becoming more harmful to society. Another huge difference in their system is the distance between the prisoners and their loved ones. Unlike our country, where our prisons are massive and spread out amongst the state, with travel times often exceeding 3 hours to visit someone's family or friend, Spain has smaller-sized prisons throughout all of its regions. This places a focus on the importance of family and society, which has a huge potential impact on the rehabilitation of the prisoner. Once a prisoner has reached 2nd or 3rd degree status and has fulfilled at least 20% of their sentence, they may also enjoy the privilege of exit passes, which gives them access to the free world for several hours. For all inmates, even those who are in 1st degree imprisonment, if a close relative dies or their child is about to be born, they are permitted to leave to attend the funeral or birth. Of course, there would have to be exceptions made for the most violent of offenders, but How can we possibly deny a prisoner to be there for the birth of their own children or say goodbye to a loved one? Having this kind of human connection ripped away from them and not being given the chance to be part of the birth or grieve properly for someone they have lost seems abnormally cruel to me. It is not just a punishment to the inmate, but to all who are involved. What if, hypothetically, bringing their baby into the world or bidding farewell to a family member is what could potentially trigger a positive change? Just a thought. The actual sentencing guidelines in Spain are very liberal since they are based upon rehabilitation and education instead of the punishment model of crime control the United States criminal sentencing is rooted in. Due to this fact, the terms of imprisonment for the most serious of offenses, including murder, are very lenient by our standards. For manslaughter, which is the death of another caused by negligence, the person will face as little as 1 year up to 4 years in prison, which can be increased up to 6 if caused by someone driving a vehicle, motorcycle, or an accident caused by a firearm. For homicide, the penalty is fixed at between 10 to 15 years. When it comes to murder, which involves premeditation, a reward, price, or promise made in exchange, or when the killing is committed in a method that is abnormally cruel, with the intention of escalating the pain and suffering of the victim. The sentence can range from 15 up to 20 years. If more than one of these circumstances is involved in the murder, the term of incarceration will be between 20 and 25 years. Based on this definition, I don't understand how the court did not give Andrew and Francisco both the maximum terms of 20 to 25 years, since their intentional and senselessly brutal act of murder falls under this category. My only presumption is that they took their youth under consideration. I don't necessarily disagree with this model of sentencing depending on the circumstances of the crime and the offender, but premeditated murder with aggravating factors, such as in this case, should be given the maximum, if not life imprisonment. I personally have a difficult time accepting that this psychopath, Andreu Coll, will be out before he is even 40 years old. While in prison, Andreu Coll will no doubt learn from the best of criminals and sharpen his skills of manipulation. He has never expressed guilt or remorse for viciously murdering his own father with the sole purpose of stealing his fortune, and in fact, blamed the victim for pushing him too far. Francisco is a pathetic pawn of a person who fell for a master manipulator. Although his participation cannot be overlooked, I do think that his motives and intentions are important to distinguish from Andrew's. He was blinded by his distorted perception of love and desire for Andrew, and his delusional hopes that they would be together. Regarding the criminality of Andreu Coll, he fits within a type of parasite offender called the dangerously antisocial parasite offender, originally introduced in 1992 by Dr. Kathleen M. Hyde in her book Why Kids Kill Parents, Child Abuse and Adolescent Homicide. Several typologies have been established to understand the different types of parasite offenders. For adolescent offenders, the most common type is the severely abused parasite offender. This offender is the child or teenager who is the victim of violence and abuse in their home. They have no way to leave, and very often no one in their life believes that their situation is causing them serious harm. No one has offered to help them find a way out, and they resort to murder as a way to escape from continuing to be a victim. Most of these cases have found that the offender is not suffering from any mental illness, but rather they are terrified and are desperate to not be in their environment any longer. The second typology is the severely mentally ill parasite offender. Most adult offenders of parasite have been diagnosed with severe mental conditions. They commonly have been suffering from long-term mental illness and suffer from hallucinations. The murders commonly occur if they end up stopping their medication. Studies have found a connection between cases with multiple victims or unusual weapons being employed in the crimes and the likelihood of severe pathology. The third typology is known as the dangerously antisocial parasite offender. This is the type of killer, whether they are an adolescent or an adult, who views the parents as standing in the way of what they want and feel they deserve, be that money or freedom. These perpetrators tend to have a long history of antisocial and criminal behavior, may lack empathy for others, and show little emotion, which are often indicators of psychopathology. It is clearly evident how Andreu Coll fits within this type of parasite offender, based on his blood-driven and heartless motivation to be the sole heir to his father's fortune so that he would not have to answer to him any longer. He was tired of being criticized for doing nothing with his life but playing video games all day and night long. Andrew found his answer in Francisco, whom he could manipulate into helping him murder his own father so that he could return to gaming without having to hear his father complain or encourage him to do something productive or help out around the house. Andrew showed an utter absence of emotion and was void of any degree of empathy toward his father's extreme suffering at the hands of both himself and Francisco. The forensic psychologist profiled him to be a cold and highly intelligent person with a domineering personality. They addressed how he was consumed with hatred toward his father. It was noted by the media that there was a potential correlation between the young man's obsession with video game violence and real-life violence. Andreu Coll was infatuated with violence in video games, and it seeped over into his real life. Being that Andreu Coll Tur was the national champion for Dead Rising 2, his commitment to video games above all else is difficult to dispute. Regarding the concept of hallucinations or disorder derived from what can only be defined as the guy's complete obsession with video games, it was determined by psychiatrists that neither of the young killers was affected by this. It was acknowledged that they were fully conscious of their actions, indicated by the premeditation and the commission of the crime. The connection between acting out violence in the real world and playing, specifically enjoying violent video games, has been a source of psychological concern for decades now. Although research varies greatly in its findings, the only positive correlation between the variables of being exposed to violent video games and being a violent person, in particular a violent adolescent, is that there is a direct connection to aggression. Now, studies have shown that the concept of aggression does not necessarily translate into being physically violent toward another person. Much less has any study shown that violent video games can make someone have the propensity to commit violent crimes, much less drive them to commit murder. A meta-analysis conducted on the wide array of research that has studied this topic has found that violent video games do increase physical aggression in teens. But to what extent and how it relates to real-life behavior is still disagreed upon. Similar to other research, the results have been conflicting, and there are issues surrounding the methodology implemented, since it is often based on studying aggressive thoughts or feelings rather than physical forms of aggression, such as hitting, kicking, or pushing. Jay Hall, a social psychologist at Dartmouth College, was at the helm of this meta-analysis to help identify what is accurate and pertinent within the research literature. Along with his colleagues, they compiled data from 24 different studies, which specifically address the correlation between exposure to violent video games and exhibitions of physical aggression. Their analysis was also exclusive to studies that took into consideration factors that affect the relationship between gaming and behavior, such as age and baseline aggressive behavior. They found that kids who played violent video games become more aggressive with time, but it was with minimal effect. The APA conducted a 2015 literature review which came to a similar conclusion that video games can increase aggressive behavior in older children, adolescents, and young adults. Media violence does have an influence and can affect our tendencies for violence, and thus is considered a significant risk factor for aggression. But it is still only one factor. Some real-life effects were found in the meta-analysis to be significant. It was discovered that adolescents who played violent video games were twice as likely to be sent to the principal's office. Hall's theory is that when kids engage in playing violent video games, they are more likely to take risks and be involved in abnormal behavior. They also found in their meta-analysis that Caucasian players were more vulnerable to the negative effects of violent video games than other races were. Hall hypothesizes that this may be rooted in the warrior rugged mentality of Western culture, where the players identify with the aggressors in the games versus empathizing with the victims. However, there are other social psychologists who challenge it having an effect at all, pointing out the minuscule, almost non-existent effect size of a 0.08. This indicates that violent video games account for less than 1% of the violent behavior exhibited by kids and teens. Johannes Breuer, a psychologist at Jesus Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Germany, has also supported this notion. Breuer agrees that the findings would be deemed trivial by the common rule of thumb standard in psychological research, which declares any effect size below 0.1 as such. He also brings up the matter of methodology problems within the parameters of what defines a violent video game. Some social researchers may consider something as tame as a Super Mario Bros. Game or a boxing game to be violent, whereas for others, games with a mature rating like GTA Grand Theft Auto or Andrew's favorite Call of Duty would only fall under the category of violent video games. Empathy is considered to be one of the most important elements which monitor and help protect individuals and others from aggressive behavior and violence. Some social scientists have posited that it is a lack of empathy or numbing of emotional response, which is elicited by violent media, which is of the greatest concern to our society. Very little research has been conducted on the impact violent media has on cognitive and neural processes. Studies have shown that the most potentially effective forms of violence in the media are those which are depicted to be rewarding, justified, and viewed as necessary to be the hero. A brain imaging study in the journal Psychology of Popular Media revealed that exposure to violent video games can cause some individuals, in particular youth, to become desensitized to images that depict others in pain. There was a decreased neural response to images of pain in the brains of habitual gamers who engaged in violent video games. Even those who were not habitual gamers showed similar responses after playing a violent video game for as little as 40 minutes. The general aggression model has been used to help explain how exposure to violent media can impact aggression and empathy through changes in cognitive schemas, which, as mentioned in my first episode, is how someone processes information. Exposure to violent media activates particular kinds of cognitive schemas, which help to mold attentional and interpretation biases. Attentional biases simply involve how we monitor and engage with our environment, and how that affects how we interpret our surroundings. For example, if someone is playing a first-person shooter game, they are likely to be constantly and vigilantly watching what is around them, with the purpose of taking out the target and not getting shot themselves in the process. This type of monitoring can lead some people to misinterpret or misread certain stimuli and situations, and perceive them as all negative and potentially hostile. Studies have demonstrated that this type of exposure to violent media, in particular through violent gaming, can cause people to act out with more aggression and exhibit decreased empathy. Research has also noted that there is a circular relationship between exposure to violent media, heightened aggression, and a lack of empathy. Individuals who have what are described as aggressive or hostile personalities with little compassion for others seem to gravitate toward aggressive and violent forms of media. This, in turn, further fuels their already existing propensity towards violence and aggressive behavior, and helps to numb, or in the most extreme cases, even completely eliminate empathy toward others. What is not controlled for, and which many researchers do acknowledge, is the vast nuances that exist for each individual's personality traits and characteristics, in addition to their life experience. One source on its own is hardly a trigger for violence or aggressive behavior, much less a lack of empathy. We know from extensive research done on serial killers that most exhibit a lack of empathy, or are completely void of feeling another's pain. This trait has also been closely linked to issues of trauma and abuse, which they suffered in their lives, in particular during their childhood. Violent media in general has been hotly debated regarding its adverse impact on the brain and its potential to decrease empathy and induce violent thoughts, feelings, and behavior. In general, since the onset of popular music and other forms of creative expression, media has been used by some as a scapegoat for why violent crimes occur, in particular those committed by adolescents, to help us understand how someone, especially a youth, can commit such a heinous crime. Video games are the most modern form of this scapegoat, thanks to the despicable humans behind tragedies like Columbine, Sandy Hook, and the Aurora, Colorado theater massacre. These perpetrators' obsessions with violent video games created an elevated concern for how violent video games can warp young minds and encourage them to commit acts of violence. I am not a psychologist, but I personally think, like most elements of one's life, it depends on the person and their mindset. If someone already has a propensity towards aggressive and violent behavior, and they are exposed to a large amount of violent media content, in this case video games, where you intentionally cause and are rewarded for the deaths of others, can this affect their mind in a negative way? I think it is ridiculous that it couldn't have the potential to cause psychological damage or further distort their already aggressive point of view. I personally think that if an individual is already psychologically vulnerable or unstable, has a tendency to be violent, and lacks empathy for others, then violent media can have a negative, even dangerous effect on their mindset. Under the right, or should I say wrong conditions, violent media could induce heightened aggression, increase desensitization to others' pain, and may inspire or trigger violent actions. I don't, however, believe that an emotionally and psychologically balanced adult will become violent and harm themselves or others, including animals and humans, because they watch something violent, no matter what the content. As far as children and adolescents are concerned, I think there is some need for caution as to what they are exposed to and at what age, since they are in critical stages of cognitive development. As biology has proven, an individual's mind is not fully developed until at least 18 years old, and many do not until their early 20s, especially the brains of young men. No research or study can dictate or determine what, if any, negative effects violent media may have on their thoughts, feelings, and ultimately their behavior, which can help shape their perspective and beliefs. It is difficult to deny that what we are exposed to, especially in our pre-adult years of development, greatly impacts our perspective, belief systems, and how we respond and interact with others. Do I think violent video games can negatively impact a young person's mind who is mentally healthy, has a stable and safe home life, and does not have a tendency toward violence? I think it is highly unlikely, based on my own massive absorption of dark media, which I have been exposed to since I was very small, including horror films, macabre poetry, violent video games, and of course true crime. I was brought up on Freddy Krueger at literally 7 years old, which may be strange, and maybe it wasn't the most responsible thing for my parents to let me watch, but it did not decrease my empathy for others, not for humans, and absolutely not for animals. My love for anything horror-related or true crime for that matter has never influenced or encouraged me to intentionally cause harm to another living creature. One of the reasons I love true crime so much is that I do have such strong empathy for others and their experiences in life. When I learn about their stories and how their loved ones, and even those who worked on a case, were affected, it deeply moves me. I also have known a young man for many years who was beyond consumed by gaming in those critical, formative adolescent years. Although he was always encouraged to spend time doing other things as well, because he is very intelligent, multi-talented, and creative, which for the most part he ignored at the time. He was, and still is, the kindest, gentlest, and one of the most sensitive young people I know. Andreu Coll is a spoiled brat and an entitled, twisted narcissist. He not only decided to murder his own father so he could live off of his hard-earned wealth and play video games all day and night long so he didn't have to hear his father tell him anymore to stop being so lazy and unmotivated. But he essentially used a young man's affections for him and manipulated him to commit the crime. Andreu Coll is just disgusting human being, and I hope that once he is out of prison, he is left with no prospective options for having a good life. At least we know that he has no rights to his late father's estate, and most likely he will be rejected by anyone within his family and his late father's connections if he whines and begs for their help. What are your thoughts on Andreu Coll and the effect violent video games had on him? Do you think he is just a heartless, greedy murderer? Or do you think the extreme mass consumption of violence he exposed himself to affected his empathy toward others and aided him in killing his own father? Thank you so much for listening to this story today. I beyond appreciate each and every one of you, and I am so thrilled to be your host. Until next time, watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. Alita Dogma's Shades of Murder was created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Dogma. Music courtesy of Pixabay by Ashot Danielian.